Okay, so let's talk about Yoshiyuki Tomino. If you know anything about anime, you know this man is an absolute titan. I mean, he's the mind behind Mobile Suit Gundam, a franchise that's basically shaped pop culture for, over 40 years now. But here's the thing, the guy who built this entire legendary saga, giant robots, epic space battles, he said something about his own life's work that is, well, it's pretty shocking.
A declaration of defeat. I mean, let that sink in for a second. This is the creator of one of the most successful franchises ever, and he sees his life's work as a failure, not a triumph, a failure. It's a total paradox, right? The guy has all the fame, the influence, the money you could ever want. So what on earth could he possibly mean by this?
So to really understand what's going on here, we have to go back, way back. And you might think the story starts with giant robots, but it doesn't. No, the answer starts with something much more personal. The complex and honestly pretty troubling history of his own father.
Right. So this is the first piece of the puzzle. The first real clue to understanding Tomino's worldview is all wrapped up in the life of his dad, who, let's just say, navigated World War II in a very particular way. Okay, so look at this timeline. Tomino's father was, for lack of a better word, a master at playing the system. He was all tangled up in the military-industrial complex, benefiting from it, but always managing to avoid the front lines. You can see the pattern, right? He uses his connections to dodge the draft. He goes to work in military supply factories. And get this, when he finally gets drafted in 1944, he's sent home almost immediately because he's a quote-unquote valuable technician. So he spent the entire war helping the war machine, but never actually had to face any of the real danger himself.
And this, right here, the pressure suit, this was a family thing. Imagine growing up and seeing photos of these suits just lying around the house. For young Tomino, the link between cool new technology and its use in war wasn't some abstract concept he read about in a book. No, it was his family story. It was real, it was tangible, and it made that connection feel totally normal, almost inevitable.
And this way of thinking was just everywhere in his life. His dad told him this story one time about a military officer, a superior from the infamous Unit 731. And the guy wasn't talking about the absolute horrors of his work. No, he was complaining that as a technician, he could only ever become a lieutenant general, never a full general. Just think about the lesson that teaches a kid. The adult world, even in the face of unspeakable evil, is just obsessed with promotions and status. It's chilling.
So he inherits this deep-seated cynicism from his family life, and then it gets hammered home by his own brutal entry into the working world. Let me tell you, the path he ended up on was nothing like the one he dreamed of.
His big dream? He wanted to study engineering at a top university, get away from his family, and get involved in space travel. Big, optimistic dreams. But then, reality hits, and it hits hard. He fails his math exams, can't get into the industrial high school he wants, and ends up in the university's art department. Probably, he suspected, because his dad pulled some strings behind the scenes. So much for the dream, right? His ideals just got crushed by a much colder, more pragmatic reality.
And that pragmatism? It got beaten into him at his very first job. So he arrives at the studio of the god of manga himself, Osamu Tezuka, and he's immediately thrown into this insane crisis. There's an Astro Boy episode airing in 2 months, and there's no script. The order comes down, make a new episode, but you can only use old animation cells and spare film clips. He basically had to teach himself, on the fly, how to patch together a 20-minute story from spare parts. It was like being a mechanic, not an artist. And that was the lesson. TV animation wasn't about art. It was a trade, a brutal, functional job where the only thing that mattered was getting the product finished on time and on budget. So you take all of that, this cynical, super pragmatic, kind of world-weary foundation that was built from his father's history and his own tough experiences, and that becomes the bedrock for his most famous creation, Mobile Suit Gundam.
And this line, "Can you survive?" This is probably one of the most iconic taglines in anime history. But for Tomino, this was so much more than just catchy marketing.
This was the central philosophical question of the whole show, and honestly, it's the key to understanding everything else.
But here's the twist, and it's a big one. When Tomino asks, "Can you survive?" who is he talking to? Well, he's not talking to you sitting on your couch. He's not even talking to the main character, Amuro Ray. Years later, he revealed that the you in that question was always meant to be humanity, the entire species. Suddenly, it's not a personal question, it's this incredibly grim warning on a massive scale.
He basically poured every single one of his real-world anxieties right into Gundam's DNA. The failure of politics? Check. That grim link between technology and war he saw in his own family? Absolutely. The dangers of overpopulation, the arrogance of intellectuals, the fundamental flaws he saw in human nature, it's all in there. For him, Gundam was a vessel to explore all of this. The war in the show was really just a big metaphor for the self-destructive path he felt humanity was already on.
And that brings us all the way back to where we started, back to the central mystery. Because now that we understand this deep, incredibly personal, and pretty pessimistic worldview that created Gundam in the first place, we can finally understand what he meant by his declaration of defeat. He says it himself, right here. He feels like his creative circuits are now fixed. Think about that. His entire identity as a storyteller was forged in the fire of all those specific, harsh experiences we just talked about. He came to realize he can't just sit down and write a simple love story or a pure tragedy. Why? Because that's just not who he is. It's not in his DNA. He feels he just doesn't possess those different shades of talent. And that is the defeat he's talking about. It has nothing to do with money or fame or success. It's a painful, deeply personal realization that he is creatively trapped. That very same worldview that made Gundam an absolute masterpiece is now the only one he can tap into. He can only make Gundam-like things. All those themes, that cynicism, those massive questions about whether humanity can even survive, they aren't just elements he put into a show. They are the very fabric of his creative soul. And because of that, the thing that made him a legend, his greatest masterpiece, has also become his creative prison. It's what ensures he can never really be anything else.
Which leaves us with a really powerful question, one that goes way beyond just anime. Think about it. For any creator, any artist, really for anyone who pours their entire self into what they do, is it possible that your greatest success can also become your greatest prison? Can the very thing that defines you also be the cage that limits who you're allowed to become?